awesome opportunity because we have this theme today that talks about what it means to grow in our faith. And one of the most important things that we can rely on is what Jesus says. So we're going to have another parable that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to kind of set it up right now, read through it, but I'm going to invite some people to come on stage with me because tonight we're going to talk about forgiveness. And I know you guys are thinking about that and, kind of thinking about, like, what am I holding this little stick in my hand and what names are coming through my mind, and just kind of starting the process of what could it mean tonight for me to follow the ways of Christ that are upside down. Like, think about our culture right now. Our culture is just messed up. There's so much toxicity. People are angry all the time. Like, think about what happened in Buffalo because of racism boiling up in someone's heart. Think about what happened in Uvalde and, like, with precious innocent children. Like, mental health issues and bitterness, all of those are taking root in a very dark way in our culture. And I think part of this is because we haven't had the beautiful experience to have healing. To have God say, you know what, I want to take care of all the bitterness and the pain and the trauma and the things that have happened against us that have caused us to be frustrated and angry. And these are little things, and they're really big traumatic things, but it's causing our culture to have this angry, I'm against you kind of mentality. And we want to dispel that tonight. So we want you all to walk out of here having this life-changing experience with forgiveness. Because our culture doesn't promote it. They promote fighting, but Jesus says, forgive. Forgive, forgive, forgive. And do it again and again and again. So I'm going to read the parable that we're going to discuss tonight. And then I'm going to invite some people to come up here and kind of have some conversations with me. So we're going to be in Matthew 18:23. Now, it'll be here on the screen, but you can also open up your Bible apps if you want to do that, or your Bibles. Matthew 18, it has this story, so kind of use your imagination because Jesus is trying to talk to us. He says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors who was brought in owed him millions of dollars and he couldn't pay. So his master ordered that he be sold, along with his wife, his children, and everything he owned to pay the debt. But the man fell down before the master and he begged him, please be patient with me, I will pay it all. See, this servant knew that he needed to be forgiven. It was obvious he had millions of dollars of debt, and his response when he realized that he needed to be forgiven was that he actually fell down, face to the ground, and pleaded, please forgive me. And I think that's an important posture just to keep note of. We're going to continue on in verse 27. It says, then the master was filled with pity for him, and he released him and he forgave his debt. It's interesting that the master, he releases us from any obligations to pay debt. Forgiveness is not a feeling. So we want to feel like it, like, hey, I feel like I've forgiven that person, but it's not a feeling. It's a choice. It's a choice that we have to release somebody from the responsibility to pay us back from what they did to us. That's what Jesus is trying to describe here in this story. And in verse 28, it goes on and it says, but when the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. He grabbed him by the throat and he demanded instant payment. Is that sometimes how we respond to situations for people who owe us something? For someone who's taken advantage of us? Maybe not really grab him by the throat, but, just kind of want to. Verse 29, his fellow servant fell down before him and begged for a little more time. Be patient with me, and I will pay it, he said. Same thing. He begged, he pleaded, he fell down on his face, but the creditor wouldn't wait, and the man was arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. So when some of the other servants saw this, they were very upset, and they went to the king and they told him everything that had happened. And then the king called in the man who he had forgiven, and he said, "You're evil, you evil servant. I forgave you the tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I have had mercy on you?" Then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. That's what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brother and sisters from your heart. Did you hear what Jesus just said? Forgiveness is a command. I can and I must forgive. But because I can forgive, Jesus has given us the ability to forgive, and we must forgive because it's an act of obedience, not an emotional response. Then it is Jesus' promises the most reliable path to joy. That's really cool. It's the opposite. I just want to flip our ideas of forgiveness upside down because it is not an emotional response. It is a choice for you to obey the opposite of what our culture is saying, which is let things go. Do not, like it's a financial term, like let's not let this be held against me. I'm not going to let them owe me anything even anymore. Now, it's not saying, they didn't owe me something or that they should owe me something. It's not making excuses for it. It's just making a choice to say, I'm choosing to let it go even though I don't have to. I'm choosing to anyway because I'm following the way of Christ. It's a very powerful story. Jesus' parable is so good because we're really prisoners. We're really prisoners if we don't forgive because we're trapped in bitterness, in rage, and in all the kinds of things that we do sometimes because we're not ready to let things go and trust God enough to handle those things. So the man here, he had two roles. So he needed to be forgiven, but he also needed to forgive. So tonight, as I bring out this panel, I want you to think about the positions that you've been in your life. There have been times in your life where you have needed someone to forgive you. Maybe because you said something mean, maybe because you did something really horrible or even worse. But then there's also times where you have needed somebody to forgive you, and also you've been needing to be forgiven. Those are two different postures. And so I want you to think about that for yourself, because sometimes, as you're going through this moment, God is going to allow you to have remembrances, memories of times where you have needed forgiveness and where you have forgiven others. And these stories are going to help you tremendously. So if you will just take a few minutes here to welcome this beautiful panel out here on stage. Surprise! Some of y'all didn't know they were coming out here, huh? All right, we have some awesome people, and we had asked people who had stories of forgiveness that they've given and forgiveness that they've received talk to us tonight. And so their story is the sermon. This is the message that God wants you to hear tonight. And in some way, I know you're going to find the pieces of the gospel and the pieces of your story even in their story. So we're going to start with Abby. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, guys. My name's Abby. I work at Oak Hills Church. There you are.
There's your fan club.
A little bit about me. I played collegiate soccer at UTSA, which brought me to San Antonio, which now brought me to Oak Hills. So
nice. All right, Oak Hills. Hey, Abby, we're one of the things, because we've talked quite a bit, and I've heard your story, and all of us kind of shared these really emotional moments today. But I'd love for you just to tell us a little bit about your story of forgiveness.
All right. So I grew up in a Christian household. I'm the oldest of three, and it was kind of like, the sermon yesterday. I was the older brother. I knew all about God. My dad has been in ministry. My mom had been in ministry all their lives. But personally, I didn't know who God truly was for me. So that led with a weak foundation. So I always remember growing up, I always truly wanted to be accepted. I wanted to be in the it group. No matter what that looked like, no matter how I had to get there, I wanted to be in it. So I was desperate for some sort of just acceptance. So when high school came around, I started hanging out with the wrong crowd. Drugs, parties, sex, all the above, I just got wrapped up. And I was searched for acceptance within relationships that were so broken and so filled with emptiness that it ended up hurting myself. So around when I was 15, 16 years old, I was dating a much older guy who was about 6 years older than I was, so about 22, 23. Which right now, I'm looking back at myself and I'm like, what were you thinking? But at the moment, I was so desperate for some sort of just recognition from something to fill the void that I had in my heart. So later on, this relationship became very manipulative, very toxic, very hurtful, abusive. And finally, it hit a point where I was sexually assaulted. And that is where I hit my low. That was my until moment when I was trying to do my way. In this moment, I blamed myself. I said, why did you put yourself in that situation? What got you there? And I instead of, just like going to God, I ran the total opposite direction. I went back to what I only knew. I went back to that crowd that I was caught up in. I got into the sex again. I got into the drugs. I got into the boys all over again, and it just broke me. Finally, one night, I had a heart-to-heart with God, and I was like, God, why is this happening? Why did you let this happen? Why me? Why did you put this on me? I've been here the whole time. Where have you been? Little did I remember that he was there the whole time, but I had not been listening. I had been running away. So funny thing is, with blaming myself, I created a very severe eating disorder. I became bulimic, to the point where it almost cost me my collegiate soccer career. It was so bad that going back between counseling and doctors, they were like, if you don't get better, we can't send you to college to play. If you don't get better, we can't trust that you will be safe and healthy enough in the environment that you will be under and the pressure that you will be under. So finally, with the community around me and with my parents that unfortunately I had to confess to that, hey, Mom, this happened, and I don't know what to do. And as hard as it was for me to watch my parents' heart break, which they found out what their daughter had been through, their reaction and their love showed me that it was okay in that moment. So while I'm going through the counseling, the rehab, the doctors, I was still struggling with God. Like, why did this happen still? Why am I in this situation? I was good, so I thought. But it wasn't until I realized my true identity as a daughter of the true King. When I realized that God saw me for who I was inside, not the outside, that my coping didn't have to be healed by my way, by his way, is when I finally was able to heal. And when I was able to forgive myself for the blame and the guilt that I'd put myself under, is when I realized that the guy was just as lost as I was. That guy is also a child of God. So by forgiving myself, I forgave him. To this day, I can tell you that if he was standing in front of me, I would share the gospel off the bat, as hard as it is. And it did. It came back. After I was done healing and after I'd signed myself out of counseling and I felt as strong as ever, I got news that there was another girl after me who was 14, younger than what I was. And I asked God, why did I not have the courage? Why did I not say something to some sort of authority so that some girl didn't have to go what I went through? And God said, you know what, Abby? You did what you needed to do. You forgave. And at one point, he actually used Jesus as a crutch to come back into my life. We planned to meet at a coffee shop. And I waited, Bible open. I was like, okay, God, like I'm here. Like I really don't want to be here. Let's be honest. I don't want to see this guy. From what I've heard, I still am kind of struggling, but you want me to share the gospel, so I'm gonna go and I'm gonna obey. Turns out I watch his car drive by and he never gets out of his car. And all of a sudden, this just presence of comfort, like a hug from God. And he said, well done. You were faithful. You did the hard stuff. And looking back on it now, I think of James 1. Be thankful for your trials, for they mature your faith. I can tell you that if it wasn't for what I went through during my high school career, I would not be up here speaking. I would be lost out in the world trying to do my way all over again.
Thank you so much, you guys. Thank you. It's powerful. So I think what, Abby kind of teaches us is that when God forgives us, he releases us from condemnation. And so you can release yourself from that condemnation too. And I think that was the hardest part for you, right? Was just self-forgiveness.
Yeah, that, and just like with the simple things, like just having guilt looking at myself in the mirror. I had to write a bunch of verses with expo markers all over my mirror just to make it through my day. It was a choice, a daily choice I had to make to be like, you're forgiven. You are redeemed. You're not what he said you were. Amen. That isn't your identity. So something that always comes to mind is 1 Samuel 16:7, where it talks about, it's about the heart and not the outer image of the person that God anoints. Mm-hmm. So
that was on your mirror, huh?
It was on my mirror for a long time.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your story. And God has taught us so many things just from listening to you and just throughout the day. And I hope you guys really benefited from that too. And we're going to have David talk now. David, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm David Martinez. I'm the youth pastor at Newcastle Christian Church. And
Newcastle.
Been doing ministry for 20 years. So
that's awesome.
It's been fun. I enjoy it.
Tell us a little bit about your story.
So I grew up in a home where my mother was a believer, my father was not. He was very abusive to the whole family, my mother and my siblings and I. He was a drunk, a lot of things that I learned more about later. But my mom was the anchor of Christianity in our family, so she always taught scripture. And I always grew up with this thought process of like forgiveness. So you talk about forgiveness, that was my mom through and through. She's always said, no matter what, David, you forgive whatever happens. And that was like the mantra of my life growing up. No matter what, you just forgive whatever happens. So we fast forward in my life, and we fast forward all the way to I'm 24, 23, I think I'm 25. I get a phone call. I'm in middle of nowhere, southeast Oklahoma, at this men's retreat, and my wife's trying to call me. And she can't get a hold of me because there's no service, cell service down there. And she ends up calling the camp I'm at. In the middle of all these men, my name gets called out. She says, David, your wife needs to talk to you ASAP, which that made me nervous.
Scary.
That's terrifying. I'm like, oh no. So I end up talking to her, and she says, David, we just have the opportunity to adopt one of the boys in our youth group because the foster mom doesn't want to continue taking care of him. And if we don't say yes now, then they're going to put him in a group home, and we don't want that. Mm-hmm. And it's been our plan anyway, was to get into foster care. So I'm like, oh, well, do I need to come home? And so all this stuff happens, and I end up driving up, and we end up accepting this boy. He's been in our youth group anyway, so we know who he was. He's been in our house several times. So we adopt him. He's 14 years old. We have a 4-year-old, a 1-year-old, and a 9-week-old. And now we have this 4th kid.
Oh my goodness.
And so we got a teenager, and we have a girl who thinks she's a teenager, and 2 boys that are just stuck to the hip. Mm-hmm. And it was craziness. And it was beautiful. Like, we really wanted it. And so we did all the stuff we had to do. We ended up, that was in like May. We ended up adopting him for officially in December. And it was awesome. Like, his name changed, his birth certificate changed. So his birth certificate says his parents were 11 and 12 when he was born. That's how old, that's the difference of our ages. And that was awkward, and to see that, but kind of funny. So he became Martinez, and we treated him just like that. He was our kid, and that's just how it was. It was pretty awesome. So, and I would love to say this story ends that way. So he was 14. We kept him 4 years. We ended up moving to another town. We had some issues, and he stayed. He started getting kind of quiet. He turned 18, and we had these issues. Actually, weeks before he turned 18, he started like shutting us off. He made a friend. The friend was not great for him. Throughout the 4 years of being his parents, his previous foster mom, who didn't want him, kept coming in and like prying and supplying him things that we couldn't afford because she could. And it was kind of a weird issue. So he turns 18. He comes to us with bags packed and says, "I'm leaving." What? He says, "I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to tell you where I'm going. I don't want to tell you who I'm with. I don't want to tell you what time I'm going to be back. I just want to leave." And so he packed his bags and walked out our door. And almost for the last time, he came back one time to pick up some other things. And after he left the second time, we never really saw him again. He ended up going to the same school as my kids. So he was there for another year. He still had 1 year of school left. And he wouldn't even talk to him.
Wow.
And that was tough for them.
So painful.
So all that takes place, and we as a family mourn the loss of someone in our family. And we had issues with our son, and we had no idea why he left. We have more idea now, like as we understand the process, and we were mad at the foster mom because after he left, she helped pay for him to change his name. So his name is now no longer Martinez, he's something else. And that was a big, and like she paid for it, she took care of it, she made sure it happened. And so one day, and all this, and it's been a rough road, and one day my wife, who probably takes it harder than I do, she came to me pretty excited, and she just, and I remember it vividly because she came in, she's super excited, so I got super excited with her. You know, I'm like, "Oh, we're excited about something, let's go." And she goes, "I can finally pray that the lady, the foster mom, doesn't go to hell."
Wow.
And I'm like, "What'd you say?" She's like, "I can finally pray that she doesn't go to hell." I'm like, "Honey, you realize what you're saying? Like, shouldn't it be better to say that she gets to go to heaven?" And she says this, and it's profound. "I'm not there yet." She had forgiven her enough to say, "I don't want her to go to hell." Yeah. But she hadn't forgiven enough to say, "I wish you would be in heaven." And then she got to the point where she was able to message our son. And she just wrote, "Hey, we love you. I forgive you." And he replied with, "For what?" And that's where we're at this point.
Because sometimes it just doesn't end up in a beautiful, easy story.
No, absolutely not.
Forgiveness
Yeah,
is an ongoing process.
Mhm.
Yeah. You know, one of the things we hear from your story is that when you forgive, you're just choosing to love someone as Christ loved you. And I can see that so much in your family, that even though it's hard and painful, you're still choosing to love someone who's betrayed you and even changed his name. And I just want to thank you guys for what you've done in the sacrifice of your hearts for that experience and going through all those and still going through that act of forgiveness. So, guys, thank you so much to David. Will you please appreciate him for his word? All right, we're going to move on to Delynn here. Anybody in the audience know Delynn? If you tell us a little bit. Oh, you get a standing O. All right.
They're pretty nice to me.
What church are you from?
So I'm from Community Christian Church in Fort Scott, which is actually where I work. I am the communications person at that church. So
Nice. Well, I know we've talked earlier, but we'd love for you guys to share with the people here a little bit about your story of forgiveness.
yeah, so I have been a Christian all my life. My dad has been a minister since before I was born, and my mom is the godliest woman that I have ever met in my life. So I grew up knowing Christ, knowing his plan for me, knowing the gospel, and truly wanting to share the gospel. But when I was 22, I moved to Springfield, Missouri, and I met a guy named Alex. And I was immediately obsessed with Alex. We were friends for about a year, and over that year, I found that less and less of my life revolved around Christ and the things that I had grown knowing, that I had grown up knowing, and more about what Alex thought of me and what he wanted me to do and where he wanted me to live. And so a year after we met, we started dating, and at that point, I was all in. He had all of my heart. And because of that, I was talked into a lot. And I'm not saying that it's his fault that I did these things, but I was drunk every night, blackout drunk every night. I did some things that could have ended me in jail. I had a pregnancy scare. Just a lot of really opposite things from what I grew up learning. And it was after the pregnancy scare that Alex came up to me and he said, "Delyn, in my heart, we are married, so I think you should move in with me." That's not how that works, just so you know. You need a certificate and an officiant and all of those things. But I was all for it. I was gung-ho. So knowing that that was wrong, knowing all of the wrong that I had been doing, I called my friends who I really hadn't talked to. Alex had made it pretty clear in the beginning that he was the only person who cared about me. So I kind of stopped talking to my friends. I started distancing myself from them, but I decided that they needed to know that I was taking this step in my life, and called them. And as I was reliving these moments, I realized that each of my friends, while I was on the phone with them, was grieving the person that I used to be. They were all so angry with me. None of them were even close to on my side. And even after going through all of that, I decided to call my parents. And that was the hardest conversation that it's the second hardest. I'll talk about the hardest in a second. But so I called my mom. Well, I called both of my parents, but I called my mom's phone, and they were on their way to a Royals game. And I said, "I have decided that I'm going to move in with Alex." And my mom hung up the phone. And I was sure that that was the last I was ever going to hear from her. I knew, like, we were done. Alex came in, and he said, "Yeah, you didn't need them anyway. I'm the only person that cares about you. So we'll just build a life together." Thankfully, I got a text from my mom later that night, and she said, "I want you to meet your father and I at Ozark Christian College in Joplin tomorrow. Come alone." So I did. I went, and my mom cried, and my dad spouted off some beautifully phrased questions about what I wanted my life to look like. And he had me write down, like, at the end of my life, what I wanted to look back and see. And I said, I wanted a family who loves me and who I love dearly, like a husband and kids and their kids, you know. And I wanted them to all be happy. I wanted to look back and say that I had lived a happy life. And my dad stopped me and he said, "You're not going to get there going down the path that you're starting on right now." So I started to give them the answers that they wanted to hear, and we left the chapel at Ozark. And I was thinking, I have fooled them. I'm going to go back to Springfield. I'm going to do whatever I want. And screw the conversation we just had. So then I called Alex, and during that conversation, the things that he said to me made something click in my head. And I knew in that moment that if I went back, I was going to die. Either he was going to kill me or what I was doing was going to kill me. So my parents had graciously offered, while we were in the chapel, to let me move back in with them. And that was not something that I was going to do. But I, after that phone call with Alex, went to them and I said, okay, I need to move home. I can't do this anymore. But you have to understand that all of my stuff is at Alex's house. My dog was at Alex's. So, and I was terrified. He told me that I had 5 minutes to come in, get everything, and leave. So my amazing parents drove to Springfield with me, sat outside of his house, and sat on the phone. I had my phone on speakerphone so that they could hear if anything had happened. I ended up moving back in with them, and it was a struggle for me because I knew every time I saw them that I had crushed them. I had completely destroyed their hearts. But I apologized then. I asked for forgiveness then. I asked for forgiveness every few months after that. I am still asking for forgiveness. And every time I am met with, Delyn, we forgave you 6 years ago, and we're not looking back.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that story. And your mom's out here.
Yeah, my mom is
Yeah.
out here, and actually my cousin, who is one of the calls that I made, is here too.
That's awesome. That's a really powerful forgiveness story. And I think kind of what we can take from that is that, you know, it's really important, and I wanted your story, and I think a lot of people can connect to that, but to realize that, like, sometimes we really hurt people with our sin. And God grieves our sin, and so should we. But man, how beautiful it is when you've identified your sin and confessed your sin and just got things right with your parents, that they're right back. What a beautiful story that God has written because of that forgiveness. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to move on to Kim here. Kim, where are you from?
I'm here with Compass. Shout out.
Well, we love Compass over here.
love Compass.
I'm from Compass too. But Kim has a really powerful story, and I asked her to share her story too. So tell us a little bit about your life.
Yeah, so I like to say that my forgiveness story is like 20 years in the making. I grew up in a pretty broken home. From a young age, I experienced a lot of just brokenness. My mom really struggled with alcoholism. She had a lot of anger management issues, and she became like codependent in her relationships to the point of allowing an abusive relationship in our home. And it was because of that abusive relationship that me and my younger sister went on to go into a foster home. We were foster kids. I was in a total of 3 foster homes, different families. And at the time when this was going on, I didn't know Jesus. I didn't have that anchor, that rock to lean on. It wasn't until later on when I was in high school, because I was in middle school when all of this was happening, that I found him, and that I realized that he would never forsake me, that he would never leave me or abandon me. And I say that because there was this moment in my life, there's this pivotal moment in my story where I was sitting with my family, with my mom and my sister, and we were sitting in the living room just like this, and the social worker was there, And the social worker looks at my mom in the eyes and she says, "Do you want to live your life with your boyfriend, or do you want to live your life with your children?" And I'll never forget when she said, "My boyfriend." And so I packed my things up in a garbage bag. That's all I got to take. And I went off to my third foster home, and I'll never forget the feeling of being one phone call away from being a child of the state. Not being like my mom's child, but a child of the state. And, I think that God through my story and my life really redeemed that idea of family. My youth pastors in high school slowly, as life went on, became my parents, and he redeemed that family for me. Now I'm an adult and I have my own family, and it's beautiful. But here I am now, walking still through that forgiveness when my mom wants to be a part of my children's lives and my life. And, what does that look like? And I think I'm constantly recalling that story in the Bible where it's like, how many times should I forgive? 7 times? And Jesus says, no, 7 times, 77 times, 1,000,000 times, an infinite number of times forgive. And I wake up every morning forgiving my mom for what she did, knowing very well that I will never hear and I'm sorry from her. Knowing very well that I might never get closure, that I might never get, I apologize for what I did to you, for what my actions put you through. But I still wake up and choose forgiveness because I decided a long time ago that I didn't want to be anything like her. I didn't want to be anything like the person that she was. And anything that was like her, I wanted to be the exact opposite. And so I wake up every day. I think that that Bible verse that says, you take your thoughts captive. You guys know that one? You take every thought captive. I think we have to take our unforgiveness captive. I think every day it's an actual choice, of a real decision to say, I'm going to forgive this person who wronged me, even though they might never apologize to me in my lifetime. So.
I think it's interesting that you said it's not it's not something that just happened, and it's still happening. It's in the process of forgiveness because, like I said, forgiveness, it's not a feeling, it's a choice that you're choosing. It's not a destination. I love this quote. It's a decision to go on a journey over and over every time it rears its ugly head. That's what forgiveness looks like. We've talked about such beautiful stories, but you have your own stories too. So I think probably a majority of the people can relate in some way to people up here who have shared their stories of needing to be forgiven and also needing to forgive. And your story is not going to match theirs because you're created uniquely and specifically, and your story is very different. But the challenge and the opportunity that Jesus gives you to live in an upside-down world where his kingdom is on top and Jesus gives you the best joy that you can ever imagine is when you choose to forgive. But choosing is the key here because it's not a destination, it's a journey that continues on. And so as I close here, I just want you to now, we're going to go into another moment, and I want you just to imagine that you're sitting in a chair, and the person that you have hurt, your parents, your friends, people that you go to school with, someone that you've been cruel to, maybe even this week, is sitting right in front of you. And I want you to just kind of close your eyes for a minute and imagine what you would say to that person. And could you imagine yourself saying to that person, I'm sorry I hurt you when I did this? Can you imagine that? I ask you to forgive me. Because forgiveness is a choice and it's also an action. And imagining you having that conversation is just the beginning of what God wants you to do to release this bitterness and anger that continues to infect your souls because bitterness stays inside. Now I want you to imagine a different scenario with a person who you wrote their name on the back of your piece of stick there. That person that God has been prompting you, that you wrote down that you need to forgive. What if that person was sitting in front of you? Could you look at them and imagine yourself saying, you know, you really hurt me when you did this, and it was not okay. But because I trust God, I'm going to let God deal with you. And I'm going to acknowledge that God is so much more powerful than I am, and he can take this burden. And so I'm releasing you of the debt that you owe me and letting God take that burden from me. I want you guys to think about that. Like, how could you release and choose to forgive? Thank you guys again. I'm so proud of you and really thankful for this moment. So.